Hi, we're going to start. Hi. um, so I'm here to make welcoming remarks. I'm Mariette Bates. I'm the academic director of the Disability Studies program here at the CUNY School of Professional Studies, and I want to welcome all of you who are here in person and all of our online participants. Warm welcome to you. Um, April is Disability Awareness Month, but here at SPS we like to get a jump on things, so we're having a lecture here in March instead. And we're very, very lucky here tonight to be able to have Dr. Beckwith to share her research about disability servitude. I want to acknowledge our alumni who are here, our current students, some of our faculty, members of the disability community and their allies, and thank you very much for coming tonight. The School of Professional Studies began in 2003, and one of the first programs that we offered was our graduate certificate in disability studies. And even though our dean, John Mogilescu, isn't here tonight, I want to make sure to acknowledge him, because really without his support, we would not be able to have grown our program to offer our bachelor's and master's in disability studies and our new master's of science in disability services in higher education. So I want to acknowledge his support, as well as our associate dean, George Oddie, who's in the back, who has been a really steadfast supporter of our program for the last decade. So I want to thank George for his help. Whenever I have a problem, I go and talk to him, and he's always very calm and helps me with it. So I want to also thank our terrific event coordinators, Heather Zeman, who's there, Nydia Cordova, who is in the back. They've been so thoughtful and professional about coordinating this event that I really think they deserve a round of applause. And I want to thank Darian Robinson, who's doing our AV over there for our simulcast, who's terrific. And Lisa Pollock, our Assistant Director of Disability Studies, who couldn't be here tonight, but who was really helpful in the planning. And I have to say, actually, everybody at SPS is just wonderful. They really care about our students. They make my life really, really a joy to work here. So I wanted to thank them as well. So our disability studies program really weaves disability rights and disability advocacy throughout the curriculum. So it's not an accident that we have invited as our speaker tonight our decades-long advocate for disability rights. I think I first met Dr. Ruthie-Marie Beckwith in the 1980s when we were both working on developing self-advocacy in our respective states. I was providing support to the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State, and Dr. Beckwith was developing People First of Tennessee, a disability rights organization that ended up being run by 600 people with disabilities in that state. So although I was kind of an encourager of self-advocacy in New York, Dr. Beckwith was really up to her elbows in doing the work in Tennessee. And her project was really a groundbreaking project in the history of self-advocacy. As a student, Dr. Beckwith has worked with former residents of Clover Bottom Developmental Center, which opened in 1923 and just closed a couple of years ago. And then she coordinated plaintiffs' efforts and lawsuits against Arlington Developmental Center, another institution in Tennessee. But it was through her work with People First that she first heard many former residents of Clover Bottom and other Tennessee institutions speak about their unpaid work in the laundry, in the fields, or as aides caring for other residents in those developmental centers in Tennessee. The results of those early conversations sparked her interest in the subject and resulted in the research that culminated in her recently published book, Disability Servitude, which was just published a few weeks ago. The subject of tonight's lecture is incredibly important, but it's been largely overlooked and neglected in disability history. So disability servitude is certain to become a key text in disability studies. As a public policy issue, subminimum wage issues for disabled people are rarely brought up and seldom covered in the media, except when there are these egregious situations like the article in the New York Times a couple of years ago the Boys in the Bunkhouse, which you probably know about a group of men in Iowa who had worked for 30 years in a turkey processing plant from dawn to dusk for a period of 30 years, receiving $65 a month for their work. But the history of unpaid work by disabled people has a very long history that parallels the rise of the large institutions over the last really 150 years. What's been constant over the many decades is the systematic exploitation of people with disabilities through unpaid labor, either through peonage or by providing subminimum wage to disabled workers. Dr. Beckwith likes to say that she causes confusion and chaos wherever she goes, but I think it's a necessary personality trait for advocates and innovators. I look forward to her disrupting the status quo tonight a little bit, and I hope you'll join me in giving her a really warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Mariette, and good evening to everyone. I again would like to thank you personally for coming to tonight's presentation on disability servitude from institutions to sheltered workshops. I'd like to take a moment to thank the faculty, thank the program for hosting me, and in particular, I want to thank Dr. Mark Friedman, my direct support person for this adventure to New York from Tennessee, and all of the support he gave me during the time that I was working on the book in our home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Tonight I'm going to share that journey, the journey that I had into the history of the exploitation of the labor of individuals with disabilities. But before I get started, I want to note that we also have people joining us from joining the presentation via webinar, and they are also coming from all over the country. We have people from the Southeast, we have people from the Northwest, we also have people from Africa and people that registered for the webinar from as far away as Asia. And so one of the people who registered was from the Congo. He's a CUNY student that takes classes from the middle of nowhere in the Congo. Is very crazy to me. But here tonight, how many people here are from the Northeast or from this area in particular? Okay, people from the South? Okay, oh, anyone from the West? Great. So we have a really broad, diverse group of people that are participating this evening, and I appreciate, again, everyone who's coming and everyone who's here. Tonight, I'm also going to give away 2 copies of the book, and there'll be a raffle for that, one for people that are here in person and one for the people who are participating via webinar. And so if you didn't get a raffle ticket, please make sure you do so before the end of the questions and answers, because that's when Heather and Nydia are going to help give away the 2 books that I brought for people to be able to take home with you tonight. Finally, even though books are not available for sale at this event tonight, I want to encourage you to purchase a copy of your own. And Palgrave has provided discount coupons for you, and they were available at the table here. And if I'm sure we'll make arrangements for people who are coming and joining us by webinar to also have access to the discount code that's on the coupon to make sure that people can purchase the book with the discounted price. And I've been told repeatedly that the ebook is coming, and so hopefully that will also be available sometime soon. So if you need it via ebook, that it'll be available to you soon. So, find my clicker. In 1902, Walter Fernald, who was the superintendent at the Massachusetts State School for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Youth, one of the first institutions in the country, gave a description of his vocational training program, which they referred to then as industrial therapy. And at our stone piles at Waverly, this is what he said, at our stone piles at Waverly are pretty nearly the first step to industrial work. We have 2 circles of stones. There's one here and one here. and they're 30 feet apart. We fill one of these circles of stones with stones about as big as a man's head. Then all of the stones of one circle are carried to the other side, and the boys go home to lunch. That is the primary lesson in our industrial training, that stone pile. The closing of sheltered workshops in our country has gained, will continue to gain attention as individuals with disabilities continue to pressure state and federal officials for improved access to economic equality in the form of integrated employment that pays real wages. And proponents of policies that currently relegate over 400,000 individuals to work in sheltered workshops to lives of perpetual poverty will continue to seek support from the press and the public for maintaining the existing segregated system. So to more effectively counter their arguments, I think it's important for us all to have a better understanding and ability to explain how we got to where we are tonight, how we got to where we are today, and how the existing system was not created with the goal to help people with disabilities gain economic authority. I wrote Disability Servitude to try to understand and expose the darker side of the institutional industrial complex. And as part of my research, I wanted to create another base of information that all of us could access to create to counter a cultural narrative, a body of knowledge that would help us counter a cultural narrative that portrays individuals with disabilities as helpless children who will always be in perpetual need of our pity, protection, and kindness from strangers. And even though, obviously, I don't have time tonight in this presentation to touch on all of those counter narratives, I made an extensive list in Chapter 7, so people have something to refer to and fall back on. And the arguments that are in Chapter 7 are those that I've compiled from people who have labored in the field over the past century to demonstrate that people with disabilities are capable of useful, important work that pays real wages. And so please, take time to seek those out the next time you have to pose an argument counter an argument why subminimum wage is a valuable tool for people to have to keep people employed. But almost from their inception, efforts to segregate people with disabilities resulted in dehumanization, exploitation, and the ongoing devaluation of their labor and potential for integrated employment. Now, I've been fascinated with the history of our field. When I first started teaching special education in 1977 in rural Kentucky, it was the first year that all children with disabilities could go to school. It was Public Law 94-142, and I was at the vanguard. I was blessed to be one of the very first teachers in a schoolhouse in rural Kentucky in the Green River that didn't have air conditioning and was forced to accept children who had not, from their community, who had not been to school. In my classroom, I had 16-year-old twins who had never been to school. In 1980, I moved to Tennessee and started working as a house manager and then as the assistant director of a residential agency that ran group homes and apartments for people who had moved out of the Clover Bottom Developmental Center there in Nashville, the institution that Mariette referred to in my introduction. And that's where I first met Herman Kaplan and learned about his failed attempt to try to get paid for back wages for labor he did when he was at the State Institute at Clover Bottom. And then later as the staff advisor for People First, understanding the history of the lawsuits that were filed against institutions became even more important to me as I helped their leadership become the first organization run by people with disabilities in our country to file class action lawsuits on behalf of their members against the state-run institutions. and 3 out of the 4 institutions in Tennessee have closed as the result of that labor. The last one is due to close next year. Given all of this interest and experience, I thought I was fairly knowledgeable about deinstitutionalization and lawsuits like Wyatt versus Stickney in Alabama and Willowbrook here in Staten Island all got started. But what I was surprised to learn from my research was that it was the unsuccessful efforts of the resident and patient workers to get paid for all their labor that had a far greater impact across the country. So before I go on, I've given you a little bit of history, and Dr. Bates did as well, just going to get a sense of where people are from and what your own experiences are with work and exposure to people who have lived and worked in segregated environments. So how many people here have worked in a state-run institution for no pay? Anyone tonight? Was there anyone on the webinar? No answer. Has anyone here ever worked in a sheltered workshop for sub-minimum wage? One person in the back. Anyone on the webinar? Has anyone worked as a support person in a state-run institution? Anyone in the back? No. Has anyone worked as a support person in a sheltered workshop? Okay. All right. All right. And then has anyone worked as a support person in supported employment, helping people find jobs in the community? Great. Nice representation. And finally, has anybody here ever worked for subminimum wage in any kind of job, as a waitress perhaps, or a server, or as a companion in a group home? Yes. As a graduate student. So, yes. So we all have a feeling of what it might be like. Many of us, a good number of us, have a feeling what it's like to earn less than minimum wage. So tonight's presentation, I'm going to talk about the types of labor that the residents and patient workers performed. And I do want to note that I'm using the terms resident and patient workers in a specific context. The resident workers were those, and this is how they were referred to in the cases and in the history, as those persons who worked in the state-run institutions for people with intellectual disabilities for no pay. The patient workers were those who worked in the state-run institutions for people with mental illness, or the state mental hospitals, for no pay. And I also want to say and share that, obviously, that from a historical context, I'm going to be using from time to time terms and labels that are no longer considered acceptable for us to use as we communicate about and talk about people with disabilities. And I only do so to retain the historical integrity of the reference that I'm using. Secondly, I'm going to explain what the peonage cases hope to accomplish and how public policy failed failed the employment aspirations of people with disabilities. I'm going to give a very short, brief background of the Section 14C3 provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act that provides for the payment of subminimum wages for people with disabilities and other people who are fighting to overcome that part of the law as well. I'm going to share historical and current issues that are associated with sheltered workshops that I identified through my research, and then how these workshops became a de facto extension of the state-run institutions and really ended up with people having little pay and even less meaningful work opportunities. And finally, I'm going to touch on the promise that the current Employment First initiative has and holds for creating a new legacy of integrated work for people that is fairly compensated for all individuals with disabilities. So what was the history of involuntary servitude in the state-run institutions? And I want to stress that, as I said earlier, involuntary servitude happened in all kinds of institutions. For example, the dresses in this picture were made and worn by the patients who lived and worked for no pay at the Clarinda State Hospital in Clarinda, Iowa. Involuntary servitude happened in institutions, schools for the blind, schools for Native Americans, Indigenous people with disabilities, people with mental illness. The veterans' hospitals. It was pretty pervasive throughout the institutional system. And what did resident and patient workers do? What type of work did they perform? Essentially, they performed almost all of the work needed and necessary for building the institution and sustaining it. Earlier in 1883, Walter Fernald, the superintendent of the Massachusetts State School, reported at a meeting of the superintendents of all of the state-run institutions at that time that in the institution, the boys assist the baker, carpenter, and engineer. They do much of the shoemaking, the tailoring, and the painting. They drive teams, they build roads, and they dig ditches. Nearly all of the institutions have large farms and gardens, which supply an enormous quantities of milk and vegetables for the consumption of the inmates. This farm and garden work is done largely by the adult male imbeciles. A reporter in the Toronto Star just recently, in a recent article that was about research that was done by a colleague, Gerald Rayum, who also studies this issue in Canada, described this wall that was built by the patient workers in 1877 at the Provincial Lunatics Asylum in Toronto. And he said that when the Provincial Lunatic Asylum wanted walls built to close off its inhabitants from the outside world, the patients dug the foundations, they laid the stones at the base, and they stacked the bricks nearly 5 meters high. This wall still exists. When the asylum was built a branch in Mimico, the patients constructed the buildings that would one day house them. For 8 years, they labored, building now what is now used by Humber College's Lakeshore campus. Patients also, and residents, also performed work that was done outside of the institution at the request of the community or at the request of specific individuals. This particular slide has a picture of the Rosewood Center that is in Maryland and women performing household chores. In 1937, Leo Kanner, who was an employee at the Rosewood Center, found that an astonishing 166 patients had left Rosewood State Training School under a writ of habeas corpus from 1911 to 1933, with nothing at all to explain why they were released. So he and a diligent social worker named Mabel Krause looked into the matter further, and he confirmed that these girls, women, and a few boys had not only been legally snatched from Rosewood right under everybody's noses, but they had been bought as rich and unpaid laborers and indentured servants by the rich in Baltimore. Residents also performed work on behalf of local communities, and what ultimately became the New Lisbon Center in New Jersey was originally a colony that was formed as an extension of the institution. And one of the things I was really surprised by when I first began looking at the types of labor that people perform was the fact that the men who built the colony and then lived in the colony also became expert firefighters. Now, my son works and has worked and done conservation work in Arizona, and I've had a chance over the past couple years to meet several people who do this for a living and they're referred to as hotshots, and they're paid an exorbitant amount of money to do very, very dangerous work that has resulted in the death of a number of hotshots over the most recent years. And so when I read that, a whole group of men with intellectual disabilities had formed a firefighting team and had become expert firefighters and were frequently called upon by the local community to protect their homes from fires, I wondered how it was that they were never able to earn the same wages that the hotshots in Arizona have been able to command. The work that the residents did and the patients did was widespread and necessary to sustain the institution's growth, and it was also coerced. Pat Deegan, who is a mental health advocate, well known within the mental health consumer movement, took a tour of Vermont State School. And the tour guide during that time pointed out that during the late 19th and 20th century, that these heavy lead shoes were routinely attached to the patient's feet when they worked on the hospital farms. And she explained that the lead shoes were strapped over the feet and then a chain was inserted through the round holes that you can see here in the photograph. This tethered both feet at no more than a stride's length. In effect, the lead shoes stopped the patients from running away from the hospital while they were working in the fields. Now, to be sure, the coercion continued well beyond the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1972, Bruce Enos, who was one of the attorneys who worked and tracked the progress of the peonage lawsuits, noted and reported that there were periods of rebellion on behalf of the patients and resident workers. There were periods of rebellion. 7 times in 3 years, she refused to work. But the attendants, whose workload was increased by her recalcitrance, threatened to enter unfavorable notations in her record, took away her cigarettes, ignored her physical complaints. She frequently suffered from headaches and pains in her lower back and legs, turned off the TV in the middle of whatever program she was watching, and in general made her life on the ward so disagreeable that she was forced to choose the drudgery of the kitchen over the antagonism of the ward. They're just very small, insidious ways people can make someone else's life very intolerable. So that's just a very, very brief overview of the labor and the coercion that people experienced as they worked and helped build the institutions that we have very, very slowly begun to dismantle across the country. So now I want to talk a little bit and highlight some of what the significance was of the peonage lawsuits, because that's really what brought me to this topic, was my buddy Herman Kaplan in Nashville, who had moved out of Clover Bottom, talking about the lawsuit that he and 3 other people had filed against Clover Bottom. In 1972, it was estimated that at least, by 1972, it was estimated that at least 47,000 resident workers and as many as 211,000 patient workers worked in state-run institutions across the country without pay. And, this is my favorite peonage sign, that it was purloined from the Pennhurst State Institution in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. You can see this on my website and also on my banner if you take my disability history course here at CUNY. I'm going to go backwards. This was from around 1973, 74. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We'll hear a little bit more about a couple Pennhurst people later in the presentation too. So this particular report is from the farm at Pennhurst, and it covers 1924 to 1926. And what I wanted to point out is that the establishment would later choose to try to minimize and devalue the work that the residents and patient workers had done. But as you can see from their own documentation, in those two particular years, the net earnings for the work that was done on the farm at Pennhurst was $50,000, which in today's dollars would be valued at $668,000 in those two periods. That's the profit they made off the resident labor. In Pennsylvania, again, in his 1973 study, Conley did a study of the economics of mental retardation, and he focused only on one institution, Polk State School. And he reported that at Polk, the residents in a one-year time had performed 1,770,000 hours of labor, unpaid labor, or 45% more work than the other paid workers of the institution. And he estimated that the unpaid labor of the residents add about a little over $1 million. In today's dollars, this would be equal to over $12 million. That's the value that later would become minimized by the establishment. So how was the use of unpaid labor by the residents and patients brought to an end? Between 1905 and 1988, a total of 20 lawsuits had been filed that included allegations of institutional peonage and institutional servitude and violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And 18 of these cases were brought by resident and patient workers seeking back wages. Their allegations focused on the 13th Amendment and violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1966. And that particular version of the Fair Labor Standards Act, those amendments were particularly important for the work for the cases that people were going to file. Because those amendments said and extended coverage of the minimum wage law to include institutions, which prior to that had been exempted from fair labor laws. And it included institutions primarily engaged in the care of the aged, mentally ill, or defective who resided on their premises. So tonight, I want to share the results of two particular cases, describe them a little bit in more depth. One is the Souter v. Brennan case that was filed in Maryland, and the other is the Townsend v. Cloverbottom case that was filed in Tennessee. And first, I'm going to talk about the Tennessee case and my friend Herman Kaplan. And there were 4 named plaintiffs in this case. The first person was Errol Townsend and Herman Kaplan, Clint Tucker, and Nancy Gill Tucker. And the first person you're going to hear from is Errol Townsend.
So, good evening. My name is Errol Townsend. I was 12 years old when I went to live at Clover Bottom State Hospital and school in 1951. Right off the bat, they had me working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1957, I started working 7 hours a day, 5 days a week in the dining room. For the last 8 years, I worked in the Clover Bottom dairy that was part of the farm that grew food for us residents and the surrounding community. When I was 34 years old, I was part of a lawsuit that sued Tennessee to get paid for back wages. I lived and worked at Clover Bottom for no pay 20 years.
The next person you'll hear from is Herman Kaplan.
Good evening. My name is Herman Kaplan, and I was 52 when I was part of the lawsuit against Clover Bottom to get paid for back wages. I moved to the Tennessee Home and Training School for the Feeble-Minded when I was 16 years old. When I first moved there, I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1957, I started working 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. I worked in the dairy for 12 years, the boiler room for 5, and in grounds maintenance another 8 years. I lived and worked Clover Bottom for no pay for 34 years.
Next person is Clint Tucker, and Clint needs to step away from the speaker to avoid feedback.
Good evening. My name is Clint Tucker. I was 71 years old when I was part of the lawsuit against Clover Bottom to get paid for back wages. I moved to the Tennessee Home and Training School for the Feeble-Minded when I was 26 years old. When I first moved there, I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1957, I started working 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. I worked on the garbage wagon for 22 years, in the boiler room for 5 years, in the hospital for 3 years, in the kitchen for 2 years, and in the laundry for 1 year. I lived and worked at Clover Bottom for no pay for 43 years.
And finally, Nancy Gill Tucker, Clint's wife.
Good evening. My name is Nancy Gills Tucker. I went to live at the Tennessee Home and Training School for the Feeble-Minded when it first opened in 1923. When I first went there, I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1957, I started working at 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. I worked in the infirmary, cafeteria, the dining room, and as a custodian. I lived and worked at Clover Bottom for no pay for 48 years.
The case in Tennessee originally came about when I was able to interview the lawyer who represented the residents because they had gone down to Social Security. They were in their 70s. They had worked their whole life. And when they went down to Social Security to file for retirement benefits, they were found that they were not eligible for retirement benefits because they had never been paid. And those benefits had not been deducted or paid from any of their wages like people who do work and receive regular wages. The case was ultimately dismissed in Tennessee after the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts could not enforce the Fair Labor Standards Act against states that would not waive their immunity from being sued. It was a little bit different with the case Sauter v. Brennan in Maryland, fortunately for everyone. In Sauter v. Brennan, there were 3 people who filed and participated in this case. One was from Orient State in Ohio. That was Eugene Nelson Sauter, the named plaintiff in the case. Also Joseph Lagoni, who was a resident at Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Philadelphia. And then Edward Leedy, who was from the Haverford State Hospital in Pennsylvania. And the first person we're going to hear from is Eugene Nelson Sauter.
Good evening. My name is Eugene Nelson Sauter. When my parents died in 1940, I was forced to go live at Orient State in Ohio. I was 14 years old. I worked in the kitchen of my cottage 7 days a week. On 5 days, I worked 11 hours a day. On the other 2 days, I worked 5 hours. And after that, I did housekeeping and yard work. I had 2 days off a month and was paid $2 a month for kitchen work and $2 to $3 a week for house and yard work. I lived and worked at Orient State Hospital for 33 years.
Second person was Joseph Lagoni from Pennhurst.
Good evening. My name is Joseph Lagone, and I went to live at the Pennhurst State School and Hospital in 1955 when I was 14. I worked 5 to 6 days a week for 6 to 8 hours a day cleaning my building. I lived and worked at Pennhurst for no pay for 18 years.
And finally, Edwin Leedy, who's right in front of you, Mark, from Haverford State Hospital.
Good evening. My name is Edwin Leedy, and I'm 55 years old when I moved to Haverford State Hospital in Pennsylvania in 1966. From 1966 to 1972, I worked 5 hours a day, 4 days a week as a messenger for no pay. And I'm proud to say that the whole time that I worked there, I only missed 12 days of work in 1969 because I had to have surgery.
So what do you all think happened as the result of the cases? Anybody read my book? Anybody have any ideas? Essentially, the institutions stopped all the work programs. Over the course of the 4 years that followed the Souter decision, which was later reversed by the appellate court, all of the work programs stopped. The states instead chose to hire non-disabled workers to replace the resident and patient workers. And as people became idle, the push for deinstitutionalization accelerated. We have 47,000 idle resident workers. We now have 211,000 idle patient workers. Those individuals were doing nothing and not contributing to sustaining and caring for the institution and the people who live there. Unfortunately, when people moved, they went from unpaid workers at jobs that had value and where they were able to demonstrate real competence at things that were important and valuable and would be work that they could do anywhere inside and outside of the institution, to sheltered workshops and work activity centers where the work had little pay and was of very little value and meaning for them to be doing. And as far as the courageous people who filed the cases, between 1974 and 1975, a very interesting little newsletter called Behavior Today was issued and followed the progress that the states had made. They polled all of the administrations across the country on the status of the work programs. And some institutions created sheltered workshops in-house to replace the meaningful, real unpaid work that people had done. But they found and tracked down the named plaintiffs in the Souter case. And they found that Edwin Leedy, who had been a messenger at Haverford State Hospital, died before the original decision was handed down. They found that Nelson Eugene Souter had moved out and was suing for back pay, and that Joseph Ligoni, who had worked at Pennhurst, was no longer employed. We saw the big Pennhurst sign that said peonage is now forbidden. But that he was in a small group socialization training program and was learning basic self-care skills. So he was ultimately released from Pennhurst, as were all the residents as the result of the Pennhurst lawsuit. So now that I've shared the impact and the unfortunate and important history of the peonage cases, I want to give a little bit of background on the peculiar institution of subminimum wage. And I want to do a shout out in particular to the National Federation for the Blind. The National Federation for the Blind, from the very beginning of the conversation about being able to pay people with disabilities less than workers that did not have disabilities, has mounted and continued to mount protests against this, just what they believe to be this discriminatory practice. And in this particular photograph, there are people from the NFB continuing to protest outside of one of the sheltered workshop programs. So the history of the Fair Labor Standards Act dates back to the Great Depression, when in 1934, the National Industrial Relations Act was passed. And that first law, labor law, mandated that people with disabilities be paid no less than 75%. It was a floor, it wasn't a percentage. It was, if you hire a worker with disabilities, you can't pay him any less than 75% of what you would pay someone who didn't have a disability. Now, the Supreme Court struck that down, and FDR went to war with the Supreme Court, and the end result of that battle was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the labor law that we currently operate under. And that was passed in 1938, and it adopted the same standard for paying people with disabilities no less than 75% of what a worker without a disability would be paid. And then in 1966, the same amendments that extended coverage of the law to workers in institutions also, unfortunately, lowered the floor and said that people with disabilities could be paid no less than 50% of what people without disabilities could be paid. And it also created a whole new category of work programs called work activity centers. So we have sheltered workshops and we have work activities centers. And the work activity centers were not held to the 50%, less than 50% of what people could be paid. And they could be paid based on, in accordance with what the worker's productivity was measured or thought to be. So now we have intelligence quotients, and now we have productivity quotients emerging in our field. Finally, in 1984, when the law was amended yet again, the wage floor was eliminated completely, which meant that the sheltered workshops, work activity centers, and any employer who got a certificate of exemption from the Department of Labor could pay workers based only on what they felt their productivity level to be and what it was measured to be. So how does this change, the 1984 change, how did it impact workers with disabilities? How does that really play out? So my mother worked at Sylvania. She was a factory line worker. She worked for piecework. She did piecework. So I heard about time studies and piece rate from a very young age. She was also a union steward who fought changes that management would make to how piece rate was determined for the workers on the line and individual workers at Sylvania. Here, basically, it turns into like a word math problem. And here, this example to help us kind of think through what someone in a sheltered workshop would be paid, or a work activity center, or by an employer who has a certificate. The prevailing age for stuffing envelopes is $8 an hour. The time study that was performed shows that a person without a disability can stuff 80 envelopes in an hour. So the pay for stuffing envelopes then is 10 cents per envelope. That's the standard pay. Sounds fair, that's 10 cents an envelope. If you stuff more than 80 envelopes, you're going to make a lot of money. But if you stuff less, you can see this is going to affect your bottom line. So the bottom line is, you show up for work every day from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. The van drops you off and picks you back up. And you clock in a total of 24 hours that week. You get paid 10 cents per envelope, as per the time study that's well documented in the office of the sheltered workshop. On Monday, you stuff 100 envelopes, so you're ahead and you make $10. On Tuesday, you stuff a total for the whole day, 80 envelopes, and you make $8. On Wednesday, you stuffed 20 envelopes, and then you went bowling with your group. So you only earned $2. And then finally on Thursday, you stuffed 10 envelopes, and then everyone ran out of envelopes, and so you only made $1. So who can tell me what your gross pay for the week was? What was the total paycheck, total that you earned? $21. So your gross pay for the week at the end of the week was $21. $21 for 25 hours. That's the next question. Somebody's reading ahead in my presentation. Okay. So the question is, who can tell me what your average hourly pay was? 21 divided by 84 cents an hour. That's considerably less than minimum wage. That is acceptable under Section 14C3 of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So now that we kind of get a little bit of how it plays out in real life and how subminimum wage is actually calculated, and this can also be done by the hour for work that's performed over the course of an hour, like cleaning hotel rooms. How many hotel rooms can you clean in an hour? And then they do the time study. If you're a very efficient, fast cleaner and somebody's taught you well, you can earn a certain amount of money. But if you're a little bit slower at those hospital corners, you're going to earn less. I want to go into how this system of paying people subminimum wage and sheltered workshops and work activity centers has combined to keep people in perpetual poverty and servitude. And I'm not going to go into an extensive history of sheltered workshops at this point, but suffice to say that the first sheltered workshop in the United States was established in 1837 at the Perkins Institute for the Blind near Boston. And this was based on a model that was created in Europe. And by 1934, when the National Industrial Relations Act was passed, the National Recovery Administration noted the existence of 200 sheltered workshops that represented approximately 25,000 workers. So as we said earlier, when the patient and resident workers moved, when the cases and they were forced to stop working for not being paid, when the patient workers moved out of the mental institutions, unfortunately they typically went to a boarding home and were offered no employment supports whatsoever. Some of them did end up in sheltered workshops, but for the most part, they were not offered any type of employment supports. And unfortunately, when the resident workers began to move, they went from unpaid workers, again, at the jobs that had value and they did competent, important things, to the adult activity centers and the sheltered workshops. So as you can see from my little red dot here, in 1968, when the law first passed for activity centers, we have 24,000 people approximately in shelter workshops and just about 12,000 people in the newly created work activity centers. Now, the decision in the peonage cases happened 73, 75. You can see those numbers grow to ultimately, by 1979, 6 short years after Sauter v. Brennan's decision was handed down by Judge Robinson, there are 28,000 people in the sheltered workshops, and there are over 117,000 people in the work activity centers. And this is just for the individuals who were resident workers, the people in the state-run institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. And now that number has continued to climb to today, where we have over 400,000 people in segregated work environments, earning 83 cents an hour, 25 cents an hour, maybe a little bit more. Surely nothing less than that. So as the headlines have shown across time, there's been a tremendous pressure from the federal government to begin to dismantle the segregated work environments and promote inclusive opportunities for work at real wages. And I want to touch on some of the issues that are associated with sheltered workshops as we begin to think about alternatives for employment for people that have meaning and help them raise themselves out of poverty. These issues were covered over the course of the beginning investigations that happened that were mandated by Congress. In 1966, when the wage and hour law was passed, the amendments that lowered the floor to 50%, Congress had some misgivings about that. And they ordered the Secretary of Labor to do one of the very first reports on the status of sheltered workshops because they wanted him to evaluate the potential for workers to earn minimum wage there, and they really had the intention of raising the minimum wage. However, in the report, although the executive summary that was signed by the Secretary of Labor really blasted sheltered workshops for some of the issues I'm going to talk about, at the end of the day, the recommendations did not include changing or eliminating subminimum wage provision. So since 1967, when Secretary Wirt signed that report, there have been 11 investigations and studies regarding the wage and hours oversight of the 14C3 provision. And wage and hour was the division within the Department of Labor that was given responsibility for administering this program. The first huge problem that's consistently noted are problems with the methods used to determine the wages, the time studies that we just kind of did, the math problems. And this is despite the lack of growth in minimum wage, since when it was first established, minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 was 25 cents. That was minimum wage. And the study that was done by the Sheltered Workshop Committee showed that average earnings in sheltered workshops at that time was 24 cents an hour, almost 98% of the minimum wage. However, by 2008, we can see that minimum wage, the percentage that you earn in comparison to minimum wage, went from 98% to 23%. So even though minimum wage continued to grow, your share of that growth continued to decline. The methods used to determine wages also resulted in widespread abuse. And the Department of Labor found in 2005 that 11 out of 100 workers in sheltered workshops were owed back wages. And most recently on the internet, and particularly with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, huge victory on the part of 3 people with autism who sued their sheltered workshop and were ordered to receive back wages for problems with how their wages had been calculated over the course of a 3-year period. Another huge problem was the overall administration and oversight by wage and hour. And as I read the 11 investigations, it was clear that the lack of follow-up on previous investigations had resulted in this severe and serious exploitation and jeopardy for the workers with disabilities. But even I was taken aback when I read the findings that were included in a Department of Labor report that was issued in 2001. And this report was a review of how the Wage and Hour Division had handled a 1999 compliance review. In the compliance review in 1999, the Wage and Hour Division reported on the status of 50 workers who performed a variety of entry-level jobs at a plant that had received a Section 14C3 exemption certificate. Now, this employer also operated a group home and was near the plant and claimed that their wages included meals and lodging and other services, and those benefits were calculated into the wage that they paid the workers. Now, when Wage and Hour reviewed this compliance review, they overlooked and ignored the fact that how that plant calculated the wages of the workers had been approved 40 years before. And ultimately, they were criticizing a report that was done, and the findings were left largely ignored and forgotten. And it wasn't until 10 years later that these employees at Henry's Turkey Farm, which Marianne described, Dr. Bates described in her introduction, were finally freed from decades-long servitude in Iowa. And this case can really, in many ways, helped to move and open up our current dialogue and discussion that we're having about subminimum wage for people with disabilities. In so many cases, it brought to light a lot of the problems with the policies and their need to be completely revamped in favor of inclusion. Finally, another huge problem that particularly the National Federation for the Blind has been very active in fighting is the fact that if you work in a sheltered workshop as an employee, you're not considered an employee by the National Labor Relations Board. So it means you don't have the same right to organize, you don't have the same right to grieve as workers that don't have disabilities. And that the National Labor Review Board considers the work that people do in in sheltered workshops, work activity centers, to be therapeutic in nature, and believes that the sheltered workshops has the best interests of the workers at heart, and those interests are much better represented by them than they would be by a union. So where has that left people with regard to employment options in the 21st century? The bottom line is that people don't earn anything, they don't go anywhere, and they're exploited by an industry where they're not even considered to be employees. And they have no means for redress. And a particularly poignant example of this was included in the report that was issued by the National Disability Rights Network. The title of that report was Segregated and Exploited. And this particular example that they found was of someone working in a sheltered workshop. You recall from the beginning of the presentation we talked about the stone pile at Massachusetts State Training Hospital. And we were at a sheltered workshop where we found in a far corner sat Barry, segregated away from his peers. On the table in front of him were two boxes, one with rocks and one without. Advocates were told that Barry's task each day was to count the rocks as he placed them from one box to the other. Barry went to the workshop to build skills that would help him get a job. But he, like the guys at Massachusetts State over 100 years ago, were given a box of rocks. So the main purpose of this presentation tonight was to share my research, which, as you can tell, was very tragic and uncovered far more tragic examples than I was able to share with you tonight. But I did want to leave you with a sense of what is possible. And over the past several years, a re-energized effort has been sweeping the country to replace this legacy of harm and exploitation, denigration, and the reduction and devaluation of people's labor with an effort that focuses on fully integrated and fairly compensated work as the first employment option for people. So tonight, before I open the floor up for questions and answers and the raffle for the 2 free books, I want to share the stories of 2 people that I personally helped create a path to self-employment. One person is in Georgia and one person is in Tennessee. And the first person I want to talk about is Jordan. Now, I first met Jordan. Jordan lives in Forsyth, Georgia. And when I first met him, he was in high school. And he started coming to a month with his mother, that's Mrs. Jordan, that's Mrs. Harbin, started coming to a self-employment training program that I started in Macon, Georgia. So I would drive from Nashville to Macon, Georgia once a month to have these little bitty self-employment sessions that were about as user-friendly as I could possibly figure out at the time. And Jordan had a disability label, and he was getting 504 accommodations at school, so he could get a regular high school diploma rather than a special education diploma. And he also had a gift for being able to fix anything. I mean, anything. Jordan can listen to an engine and tell you what's wrong with it. He has that kind of gift. So when I met him, by that time I met him, he's 16. He's already filled up his parents' garage with various motorcycles and lawnmowers in various stages of repair, and it's overflowed into the driveway. And he's going to the local junkyard and outbidding people for parts to fix the things that people from Macon, Georgia are bringing him to fix, because he's the only one that can figure out how to repair these things. And the last time I touched base with him and his mom, really, I touched base with his mom because he's 16, and 16-year-old young men do not want to talk to old, college professors like me. But I touched base with his mom. And the last time I heard from his mom, he had graduated successfully from high school, and he was taking some community college classes. I thought, great, he's finding his path. But a week ago, while I was working on this presentation, his mom sent me one of those Facebook Messenger things, and with a link to this headline from the local newspaper. And it was the debut opening of Harbin Repairs. So Jordan had taken the information from my very basic self-employment manual and leveraged it to be able to open his own shop on the square in Forsyth, Georgia. So I'm tremendously proud, and so is his mother. And I have access. I'd be happy to send the full article to anybody who would like to receive it. Now, my second story, Jordan obviously is a very capable young man who has wonderful supports and loving family, and a very true gift and talents for, for leveraging that into real income. But the second person I want to talk about is someone who has far more serious and severe disabilities, and this is Thomas. Now, Thomas is in Nashville, Tennessee. And I first met Thomas 23 years ago when I was asked to be his legal guardian, his conservator. And Thomas was one of the last babies born in Tennessee during the last rubella epidemic. So Thomas was born deaf and blind and with an intellectual disability label. And when I first met Thomas, he had graduated, and because of his disabilities, his mother had surrendered him at birth. So he grew up in foster care. And when I first met him, he had aged out of foster care, and he had graduated from the Tennessee School for the Blind. In a wonderful services for the blind counselor from Voc Rehab that had tracked him his whole childhood and rescued him from a nursing home at one point, and really had made sure that he got the supports he needed while he was in school. So I met Thomas when he was aged out of foster care and he needed a guardian. And when I first met him, he graduated from the School for the Blind, and he was in a sheltered workshop. And he was in a sheltered workshop, and he was doing everything anybody possibly could to explain just how unhappy he was at being there. So he had some pretty outrageous things that he was doing. And this resulted in him being kicked out of the sheltered workshop, which I was kind of happy about personally as his guardian. But unfortunately, it ended up in a long stint in a psychiatric hospital because it took a long time to find another provider that would serve him. And when we did find a provider, that provider was put out of business by the state, and 2 other providers just really couldn't figure it out. So finally, around 12 years ago, I got a group of people together, and we formed a little bitty agency that just helps him. And it's called a microboard, but Thomas's little agency is called Thomas's Supports. And after we solved some of the life crises problems that Thomas had, we hired the staff. We have a little nonprofit board of directors. We helped Thomas get a Habitat house in Nashville, so he is a homeowner. And we finally were able to get down to the business of work and helped him get stabilized. And in this case, it really did mean establishing his own business, because Thomas has a business called Thomas's Tasty Treats. And Thomas's Tasty Treats is an honor snack basket where you're really hungry and there's no vending machines in your building. So you go to the little break room and you put in a buck and you grab what other healthy or unhealthy treats you can from Thomas's baskets, and you're able to go on your way. And Thomas has his honor baskets in Nashville at several very supportive employees, several very supported businesses. One of them is the most prestigious architectural firm in downtown Nashville. 3 floors, three different break rooms for employees. And so he's very popular there. And he also has a basket at the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, where he's most popular with the IT people because Tennessee has a whole new IT, huge network that finally got fixed and rolled out, and IT workers eat lots of snacks. So he had to up his visits to the IT floor where he has his snacks. This particular photo was taken at one of Tennessee's annual mega conferences that we have that are cross disability, and the 2 women who work with him, they take turns as his job coach, and Missy on the left is a sign language interpreter in her other life, and Tay is also getting pretty proficient at sign language as well. So if we really get creative and we think long and deep and we listen to people and their families and their dreams, we can really begin to see how integrated employment is a possibility for anyone. And the opportunity to earn wages when Thomas goes to the bank with the change from the locked box, from the snack baskets. The tellers know who he is. They know his name. They know the people who support him. He's part of that community. And that's what the Employment First effort is about, and that's the alternative legacy that I really hope people come away with tonight. We need to know the history because the history can come back so quickly as policies and practices change and priorities change and funding and resources start moving around in ways that are mysterious and hard to follow. But anyone can work and anyone can earn real wages, and that's the focus of what I want. And I'm very grateful that you all came to hear about tonight. So I want to, again, thank everyone for coming, and thank the Disability Studies Program for hosting me. Thank you to Dr. Bates and to Gary Robinson and Nydia Cordova and Heather Zeman for making me feel like a real author, do all the work, send out all the notices, get all the things signed and sealed and refreshments and treats. So I really want to thank everyone and my students in particular for pitching in tonight and helping me with the presentation. So again, thank you very much. We have time for questions and answers on. Okay. The question was, how long did it take me to write the book and what was the process? I first met Herman in 1980. And I started researching this book when I left People First. I had a year, kind of a pseudo sabbatical. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the Library of Congress and begin some initial research. And then life and kids and everything else happened. So it took me 10 years until I finally was able to sit down and really focus on the material that I'd gathered. And then by then, the internet had exploded and so many more resources available to be able to pull those things together. When I finally sat down and began writing, it was a 6-month process to write, and it was a 3-month process to rewrite the book after the publisher accepted it for publication. I've been told, the question is the book available in e-format? And I have asked Milana Barakova, who is my contact at Palgrave, and she has assured me that it is almost ready to come out in ebook. So if you keep tuned on my website or through the CUNY website and check, it will be on Amazon. It's also available at the Palgrave website as well, but it is supposed to be coming out very soon in e-format. You're welcome. Yes?
Okay. I'm sorry. I have a few questions online that people are sending in. So Jason asks, I know that OPWDD has declared that sheltered workshops are to be phased out, but do you know if there is a deadline for all workshops to be closed?
My understanding from, and I am not to be quoted on this because I'm the historian and not the current events person, but the policy to shift people from segregated settings to include more inclusive settings is really being driven by the federal Medicaid and Medicare agencies, CMS, Centers for Medicaid Services. And it's in keeping with the Olmstead decision that was given down in 2000 that people should have the right to live their lives in integrated settings. And federal policy has finally caught up with that decision and has sent all of the states surveys and a mandate to review all of their programs to see where they are in terms of integration and what their plans are from transitioning to segregated to inclusive community-based programs. In Tennessee, we're told that that shift has to happen by 2019. I know some states haven't even tried to begin that process, and other states are trying to very hard to get out ahead of that curve. So that's the latest that I'm aware of as somebody. Okay, another question here. Okay, it figures it's also very intricately wound into that. When the National Industrial Relations Act was passed, it exempted prisoners from being paid in having minimum wage, and the restrictions apply to prisoners. And in fact, when they were first looking at the Pennhurst case, when the peonage cases in the Pennhurst case, Downsby, the superintendent of Pennhurst first was filed, one of the legislators on the floor got up and said, well, you know, we pay prisoners. Now that wasn't a mandatory wage, but we at least pay our prisoners. Now, when people moved out of, when the patient workers moved out of the state-run mental institution, it's very true that over the course of time, unlike the deinstitutionalization movement for people with intellectual disabilities, many of those people have ended up incarcerated. And those are federal policies that relate to how our community service mental health services for community-based mental health services have been essentially decimated and ignored and made unavailable for people. But the answer to your question, I think, is very important for advocates, because as we begin to push for less incarceration overall, that's going to include people with disability labels, not just mental illness. So we want to make sure that supports and accommodations are put in place and that we are particularly attentive to what is happening to people who are returned to their communities from local, state, as well as federal prisons. Mark and I were at a NAACP meeting last Saturday where they're trying to pay particular attention to what happens to people who are returning and the types of supports that can be networked together to work collectively on these issues across disability and across the incarcerated population. But it's a very important one for us to be attentive to as we move forward, because they should be offered the same opportunities to roll in job development and job placement programs as anyone else who's being released from the system. Yeah, another question from the web.
Yeah, so I have Amy had asked, there was an argument made that she didn't necessarily agree with, but she wanted to take note of. I found that one argument for keeping sheltered workshops sub-minimum wages going is higher wages will affect their benefits. Can you speak to that a little? Do you think that a push for full employment will have to include a push for raising income limits?
My understanding as someone who's worked as an advocate in helping people get employment is that the income limits are already relatively high and that they would allow people to work full-time, particularly at entry-level wages. There are also exemptions in the law that provide for people to be able to keep the benefits that we're very worried about people losing. So even though you earn, for example, $30,000 a year, you can still retain the medical benefits that you need in order to be able to accommodate your disability. I think that problem is less than what people want, and more information is needed. We all need to get more information out to people about how that actually works. Social Security also has benefit specialists. There are grants to the state protection and advocacy organizations that you can turn to get an individual estimate, a personalized estimate of what you can earn before you should be worried about whether or not you have to change your earnings in order to stay under whatever limits you choose to stay under. But certainly it's not an argument for keeping people paid at 83 cents or 84 cents an hour. Okay, we have a question here in the back. Absolutely. Absolutely. And VR's priority actually is supposed to be serving people with the most significant needs across the country. However, even then, and people need to be aware of the fact that they may have to push for their interest to be in an inclusive and integrated environment. I worked in one state where someone as recently as 3 or 4 years ago went to VR and has ended up in a sheltered workshop, and somebody with a college degree. So, with prior work history. And so being able to say to your VR counselor, and the law changing so that you are no longer able, in Tennessee, VR doesn't fund sheltered workshops, so it's not an option. But segregated programs still exist across the country. And so you as an advocate for somebody, you yourself need to be insistent that you be considered for fully included in compensated work. Another question here. I think first and foremost, the summary that the story that was shared was by a mother who has avidly, sought work opportunities for her son who has a label of autism. And her son is engaged in 2 different types of work, one of which is not compensated, but the other one has just recently been negotiated where he will receive some type of payment along with the person that supports him. And the question is as the early adopters, as people who are out front helping people do these new and crazy and wild ideas like snack baskets and repair shops and working on farms, as we are confronted by people who are still committed to the existing system, is what types of arguments do we give people? And in many ways, we're not going to convince a lot of people immediately. And that is one of the reasons why the federal policy shift has been necessary to really mandate that the resources and the energy that we as a field put into maintaining segregation begin to shift. And we take all of our knowledge and our creativity and our brilliance and our experience and apply them to the kinds of creative opportunities and ways that the early adopters, the people who have tried to strike out on their own and rebel against the system, have done. And the same is true as we've dismantled the institutions. In Tennessee, People First was told the institutions would never close, and that it was a pipe dream, and they were being unrealistic, and they were being this and that. And next year, the last 80 people will move. And so it takes a long time, and will take different people time and at different paces to accept that change and to begin to see in themselves that they can do something different than what they're doing today, and that the people they love can do something different and be able to move today. And I think the last kind of thing I'll say, and I'll take one more question. My brother and my sister-in-law worked at one of the big state institutions in upstate New York. He was a cook and she was a person who, worked on the wards. And so then this Pataki, who remembers Governor Pataki? So Governor Pataki decreed that the institutions would close. And of course, my relatives who were dependent on state institution workers weren't all that happy with that. And we didn't really talk about this at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinners. But one day, I get a call from my brother, the cook, and he says, "Sis, they told people we're not going to be moving people anymore. The new governor, new decision, we're going to stop moving people out of New York's institutions." He said, "They can't do that, can they? These people have rights." And so for me, if my brother, the cook, who was committed to his state job and his position as the cook in a large state institution in Western New York, can make that mental shift, I think as people see things unfold for people, other people will be able to see that too. Okay, that's a very good question. And that gives me an opportunity to pitch my book one last time because great, thank you. The question was, other than self-employment, which is a very labor-intensive process to establish and requires a huge personal and sometimes financial, but not always. We started Thomas's business with $500. So it doesn't take a lot of money to start a business. But what other alternatives are there? And I did want to point out, across time, one of the things that I didn't get into tonight was I really wanted to see what was happening as it related to labor for people who didn't live or weren't institutionalized. What was being made available for them across history? And I went back and looked at the first study that was issued regarding special education in the early 1900s. And what was happening with special education, the emergence of supports for people who didn't end up in the state institutions. And I looked at early work programs that were largely ignored, but the results of which were highly positive for people and when people were committed to helping them get work. And in particular, and there's lists here that give you lots of examples of what people can do. In the 1960s, when the President's Committee on Individuals with Intellectual Disabilities was established, one of the very first things that they pushed for was employment opportunities for people with ID labels. So over the course of 3 years, they were able to have the civil service requirements changed so people with ID could qualify for civil service jobs. And they found over the course, and this is Mrs. Schreiber, cracking this whip on people, and the president was behind the whole notion, they were able to recruit over 3,000 workers with ID labels in jobs that were across the gamut and across the federal government, across departments in the federal government. Another list that you'll find in the book is one that the National ARC put out. And it was a long list of what kind of work do people do? What are the same kind of jobs that everybody else here could do and can pursue? And so there are concrete ideas in here, and there are also concrete ideas if you look at what the University of Virginia is doing, for example, Oregon, programs where people really are trying to do evidence-based practices that help people get jobs and help people pursue greater and greater amounts of income. So I think I do welcome, and anybody, I'm going to be here for a while, and I do, again, want to thank everybody for coming. The future can be very, very bright, but we have to make sure that we don't forget that what we have now is built on the backs of people. And we want to make sure that what they build, they get to have and own in the future. Thank you very much for coming tonight and for participating in the presentation.